Welcome to On Becoming a Healer podcast. I'm Stefan with my co-host, Saul Wiener. Each episode in this podcast, we discussed stories from life. As professionals in medicine, these stories bring up themes of engagement with others, boundaries, humility, and other attributes necessary to becoming a healer. This week, we're going to interview my co-host, Saul Wiener, about some struggles he faced in becoming a doctor, ones that I didn't. Hi, Saul.
Hi, Stefan.
So, Saul, 18 years ago, you published a piece in the journal Academic Medicine, and it was called Learning Medicine with a Learning Disability, Reflections of a Survivor. Can you tell me a little bit of the story of your challenges as a learner?
Yeah. First of all, writing that piece was a bit of a landmark for me. It was almost a kind of coming out of the closet. At the time, I was, I think, into my third year as an attending, perhaps it was around that time. Even then, I was pretty reluctant to talk with people about my learning disability. Of course, I had my godfather, Simon, who, as you know, I talk about quite a bit on this podcast. And he had invited me to come down to talk to his first year medical school students on a panel about disability. I agreed to do that. And so I remember sitting there with two other former medical students, in this case, who had physical disabilities, and mine was a so-called invisible disability. After that presentation, we came up with the thought that I would write a piece about having a learning disability and send it to Academic Medicine. It was tough for me to write honestly and not hedge. What's been rewarding is that since that piece was published, which was almost 2 decades ago, I've gotten many emails from medical students, colleagues and pre-meds and parents who have come upon it and found it helpful. And that's why I thought it would be useful to talk about it today.
So for a lot of people, the expression learning disability is just a bit hazy. What is the learning disability you have?
When I was in second grade, somebody figured out that I was a bright kid, but something wasn't quite right. What I remember from those early years is just getting these assignments, like they would hand us a picture with a bunch of images, like groups of fruit, and we were supposed to circle them. And it was to introduce us to the concept of sets, like, circle all the bananas, circle all of the oranges or whatever. And I remember just staring at this thing and not understanding what it was that I was being asked to do. So I'd get up and I'd go and I'd stand on line. You had to wait in line to ask the teacher a question. And I'd get to the front and I would ask her what I was supposed to do. And she would tell me, but all I would hear would be blah, 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 blah. And so then I would be kind of embarrassed and I would go and I would sit down and I would stare at it for a while longer. And I still couldn't figure it out. So I'd get up and I'd wait online again. I'd have to wait for like 4 or 5 people and I'd get to her. And I'd say, I don't know what to do. And again, blah, 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 blah. And so this was kind of humiliating because I could tell that she was irritated or thought that I wasn't really paying attention. It was an issue of not being motivated. And after about a year or so of this, I had the very good fortune of being in a highly educated community where we were near a hospital that had kind of a pioneer in learning disability testing. And this is in early 1970s. And so I just was fortunate in getting evaluated then and getting special accommodations and support services very early in my education at a time when that was not very common. So you can imagine how when I was in high school and I got interested in becoming a doctor, I really had some challenges ahead of me. But even at that point in life, I had to adapt to the challenges of learning differently. I think that's one of the things that everyone who has a learning disability and is successful has to deal with. They have to learn how to accommodate their unique issues to what's expected of them.
So you're speaking now as a faculty member, but there's a lot of steps in between. Can you tell me what kinds of experiences you might have had as a college or medical student that I wouldn't have?
Well, for one thing, I remember taking chemistry during the summer before I matriculated in college. I avoided it in high school because I wanted to have a good GPA, and I knew if I took chemistry, it would not go well. And yet I knew I would have to take it at some point. So I decided to take it at a time where it would not go on my transcript if I did poorly. And so I took it during the summer before I enrolled in college. And I've never studied as hard in my life to get what turned out to be a C. And that's all I focused on that summer. It was absolutely brutal. But it prepared me to retake that course my freshman year of college. And again, just worked so hard to get a B after having taken the course just before. that was the kind of challenge that I had to contend with. And then I remember when I arrived in medical school, I was aware that it was going to be tough, but I didn't know how tough it was going to be. And my first year of medical school was the toughest year of my life. It wasn't clear to me I was going to make it. I had the good fortune of taking the USMLE Step 1 exam just 3 months or 4 months after the first President Bush, George H.W. Bush, signed the American Disabilities Act, which made me eligible for special accommodations. And because I had this paper trail going all the way back to second grade, and that material was all sent into the National Board of Medical Examiners, they proved it. And I may have been one of the very first people to ever get accommodations for taking the USMLE exam. I don't know if I would have passed it if I hadn't had those accommodations. This is the kind of journey that I experienced, that I wrote about when I put together that piece for academic medicine.
Does having a disability that people can't see cause problems either for your friends, your family, or the people you have to work with?
I think my behavior can seem strange at times to other people, as if I'm not paying attention or need their assistance with things that seem quite basic. And this has taken a toll on me over the years. At times I feel like an imposter, and I've had to fake things as if I know what's going on when I don't. And during my school years, it was sometimes evident that I didn't know what was going on, and people seemed annoyed. I remember in 8th grade, for instance, sitting in class and getting completely confused. It was math, not knowing what the heck was going on. And the teacher used to call on people, which was terrifying for me. And he called on me at one point and got down to the point where he kept asking me more and more basic questions. And I was kind of in a panic state. And at one point he said to me, "Saul, which comes first, 70 or 80? I mean, that was the point that we got to. And I remember thinking to myself, there are so many numbers. In fact, there are an infinite number of numbers. How in the world am I supposed to remember the order in which they're in? At that point, I noticed my classmates were just silent. And I felt kind of mortified and a sense of shame, thinking about what they must be thinking of me. It felt like no one else had these difficulties. I think it's important to understand that people with learning disabilities develop a lot of scar tissue, I guess I would say, if they make it through the academic or an educational process, particularly if it's medical school.
I will stipulate the same with you, that occasionally I have described something to you and realized that what's coming back to me is the sounds of someone who has not understood the plain English series of sentences I have just told you. And there's a point at which I have to stop myself and say, oh, yeah, he's very bright, but I have to remember he's got this thing and he doesn't always get it.
Well, you sound like my wife, who has been married to me for almost 25 years, and she still often has to remind herself that I'm learning disabled. And it's easy to think that I am disinterested or something along those lines. So yes, I do think that is something that people who have learning disabilities contend with. And I think one of the challenges is that medical training puts a premium on just being smart, being successful, doing well on tests. A lot of times, your sense of self and your identity becomes defined by being a good student. I think when you don't have that, and when that's very wobbly for you, you feel like an imposter and you question whether you belong. At least I can say that's been the case for me.
So, Saul, I'm wondering about this. We count on our doctors to make decisions that are sensitive, that need to be made sometimes in a very time-sensitive way. Don't we want them to be super bright, super effective, super fast? Should we want doctors who have learning disabilities?
It's a question that I've asked myself. The question is I've been practicing medicine for 25 years, for a long time. It depends on when you start counting. And am I an asset to my profession, or am I a mistake? I like to think that it's good to have me around in the medical profession, but maybe I'm fooling myself. I do also think that we need to ask the opposite question, which is, are the ways in which we judge people as ready or as excellent to enter medicine really valid? Much of what happens when you go through medical training is that you're taking multiple choice tests. And those tests are usually somewhat time pressured. If you don't have a learning issue, you may not really perceive the time pressure. If you do, the time pressure may be exquisite. I had the good fortune of having extra time when I took the NBME exams, the board exams, because I got accommodations. And under those conditions where I could take twice as much time as everybody else, I did fine. The question, of course, is what are the implications of that? Is there any evidence that taking a multiple choice test quickly rather than slowly makes you a better internist or pediatrician or cardiovascular surgeon? I have not seen any evidence of that. And what's interesting is that I've found now as an educator that when students have learning disabilities, particularly when they're diagnosed as adults, it's almost impossible for them to get accommodations from the USMLE. And that forces them to take the exam under conditions where they can't finish it on time, where they're not able to perform at their best. I would ask, is that actually a valid measure? What's interesting is that if we were to give everyone more time, and in fact, as much time as they want on this exam, I think what we might find is that many students just wouldn't want to sit around for an hour or two. They've gone through the test, they've answered the questions, and they're done. They either know the material or they don't. Those who do need the extra time, it's almost diagnostic that those individuals would benefit from extra time. And if you want a valid assessment of what they know and don't know, that's how you get it. So the question, of course, is why does the USMLE create such a headache for people, forcing them to take an exam under conditions that are not suited to demonstrating what they're capable of? Why not instead just give everybody whatever time they need? You know, in the old days, these tests were proctored. Somebody had to be in an auditorium. They had to be home by a certain time. Now you take these tests on a computer at a place like Prometric. What's the issue? Unless somebody can show that taking that test quickly rather than slowly is a measure of something, then why create this hurdle for so many students who have learning disabilities and need accommodations but can't get them?
So just to put this very clearly, if I have a learning disability, are you worried that I cannot figure out how to remove a bullet quickly from a person who's been injured? Are you worried that I can't figure out the difference between a heart attack and heartburn?
Well, what I would argue is whether you have those skills or not, I don't think we know based on how quickly you take a multiple choice test. I would argue that unless somebody can show evidence otherwise, which I've never seen, there's very little indication that those are similar skills, that that's the fundamental issue that we need to contend with. Is our assessment valid?
So the United States medical licensing exam obviously is one of the key hurdles here, because they set the parameters for how tests are administered, and medical schools rely on these tests as an indicator of whether they are succeeding or failing. Is there any hint that we could seek a conversation with the people who run or sit on the boards of these organizations to begin to think about how they respond to learning disabilities?
I do recall some years ago that Simon sent them a letter. Don't think it went anywhere. I think it was politely received. I think it's an enormously important issue. And I think that for so many students who struggle with these exams because taking them under normal testing conditions is not suited to their abilities and to their skill set, it causes enormous hardship. As a faculty member, I've been on promotions committees where and as an academic administrator, I've seen countless students hit a wall because for whatever reason, they're not good test takers, or they can't take the test under the conditions that it's offered and perform well. I think we underestimate the amount of harm we cause as these students get stuck in their education, feel terrible about themselves, are questioned by those around them as to whether they're competent and capable.
We've talked a little bit about the systems level issues here, and we talked about the accommodations you got in certain test-taking situations. But do you want to tell us a little bit about what you had to do in order to overcome your own disability in the process of learning medicine?
At a practical level, I've had to come up with workarounds for almost every task. So for instance, even now as an attending, when medical students or residents present even the most simple patient to me, somebody with a cold, I'm taking notes. I'm writing down, and I've developed this kind of scribble that nobody else can read. I guess you could call it HIPAA compliant, but it enables me to take notes at a high speed. So I can pretty much write down what's being said to me while a patient is being presented. And I'm actually only able to process what I read, not what I hear. So that while the patient is being presented to me, I'm writing down what I'm hearing in real time. And I'm processing it by reading what I'm writing down, not by what I'm hearing. I know that sounds really weird, but I can write what I'm hearing without understanding what I'm hearing, but then I process what I'm reading. And that way I'm able to function. When I'm in a conference room and people around me are talking and I need to write a note, I put white noise on with headphones. So pretty much for every situation, I have a workaround. And I would submit that others who have learning disabilities who are successful in medicine function similarly. I mean, we all find our own ways of adapting, but we all find them.
What do you recommend for others who are trying to make it in medicine but have a learning disability?
I think a process I had to go through is one that others who I think are successful all go through, which is you have to figure out how you learn and how you accommodate virtually every type of situation you find yourself in, which creates a kind of ingenuity, adaptiveness that I think is its own strength.
When you say it creates its own strength, what do you mean?
For instance, I learned early on how much I need the help of others to check my work and confirm that I'm not making a mistake. On post-call days, I routinely ask other residents to check my prescriptions, particularly for any medications where an error would be, a serious problem. Even when I'm working with junior medical students now as an attending, I partner with them as I'm aware that they can do things I can't do. So having a learning disability is a constant reminder for me of my fallibility, which I think in the long run is good for patients. In some respects, I think that having had a learning disability while during the period of my formal education was an enormous hurdle for me. In the long run, it's possible that it was the best thing that ever happened to me. The downside, of course, is it can cause a lot of emotional baggage going through that experience. I had the good fortune of having the support of Simon. And one of the things that I learned with his support and insight is that medicine is a highly socialized culture and that people start to define themselves by how they do on these exams. And you can't fall into that trap. Instead, you have to think about yourself as intrinsically worth as much as every other individual. If you're able to see that, if you're able to recognize that you're not defined by whether you make it through medical school or not, or how successful you are, you're defined by whether you are able to be true to yourself. And I don't mean that in a corny way. I mean that you're able to stand up to the values that you believe in. And if you came into medical school, that's probably ultimately to be a caring physician. If you're able to hang on to that and not define yourself, and in some cases, as I wrote about, recognize that even if you don't make it through medical school, that doesn't define you either. There are many ways in which you can contribute to society with great richness and meaning. And so I think that it forces you to, in some ways, define yourself and not fall into the traditional socialization, which I think is so potent and in many ways harmful to the development of physicians.
I think that one of the postures that we both share here, even though I don't have a learning disability, is that we want to do good work in medicine, but we recognize that a large culture of medicine is not always set up to promote our being the best people we can be. So the navigation task we have is to figure out how can we achieve those things, sometimes despite the structures of medical education, not because of them.
Yeah, sometimes I think that having a learning disability can actually help protect you from a culture of competitiveness and of defining yourself by how great a student you are. This may have dawned on me first once when I was an intern and I happened to be cross-covering for another resident who had a reputation for being really smart. He was someone who I found intimidating at morning report, and he always seemed to know everything. Yet, once when I was cross-covering for him, I discovered that his patient care just was kind of a mess. He wasn't very conscientious. I realized that while I didn't have his fund of knowledge, I did at least have a work ethic of trying to be sure I didn't screw up or miss anything. I think that having to be basically a workhorse rather than a thoroughbred may have positively shaped me.
For those of us who are coaching or teaching or supervising, are there things that we should look for to at least inquire whether we need to make some form of accommodation in terms of how a team works on the hospital wards or something like that? Is there something I should be looking for?
I think if a student is struggling, it's important to start with the premise that they're smart enough to be successful in medical school, or they wouldn't be there, barring the rare admissions mistake. But in most cases, it simply means that it's going to take them a little longer to catch on, not that they won't be as good as their peers when they get there. The difference is that they're having to figure out how to work around whatever challenges they have to acquire the necessary skills under the given circumstances. By going through that journey, they may actually gain insights about what their patients really need that their peers don't have.
So what can we do when we see a student who is struggling?
When you see a student who is struggling, rather than preaching to them what you think they should be doing, it's important to let them tell you what they need, to ask them how they're doing, how they feel about the experience. Just an open-ended approach to saying, how are things going? I noticed you had some challenges presenting or challenges with your note or whatever. What do you think might help? What works for you? When are you at your best? Allow that person to become comfortable enough with you that they can begin to relax and show how you can help them adapt.
Yeah, the question I think that those of us who have some modicum of authority for a period could say is, when are you at your best, and how can I help you have the best possible experience and make the best possible contribution? And what are the things that stand in the way of that? And how can I help you with those? I genuinely want to help.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, I think it's important to recognize that many of these students shine in other ways, that students who are great at multiple choice tests or presenting patients on wards may not be good at it at all. We all have our strengths. We all have our limitations. And just as people who are blind often compensate through other senses, students who struggle at presenting patients may be exceptional at engaging with them. When the door is closed and no attending's watching, and that patient is frightened, scared, and struggling. Those are the kinds of things that I think we need to recognize when we're, on the one hand, frustrated with a student, that they may have enormous strengths that we just don't know about.
From this, I'm going to be paying close attention to that, and I'm going to be asking those questions. And I think, thank you very much, Saul. This has been a great discussion.
Excellent. I hope our listeners have found it helpful. For those of you out there who have not already subscribed to our podcast on becoming a healer, please consider doing so. And if you like what you hear, let others know about us as well.